Well, good morning and welcome again. This is kind of a different message and I'm hoping I get through it without losing it. For those of you that looks like a first time here when I spoke, I'm not a preacher, not a minister, I'm just a storyteller, and hopefully something good comes out of the story. This is about, I'll call them two young men, 16 years old or so, and the one knows about the other one doesn't know the other fella at all. And the first boy is Charlie, and he comes from a good family. His dad has an excellent job. He's got a six-figure salary. His mother doesn't have to work because she does a lot of volunteer work, a local hospital, Salvation Army, things like that. They're a good Christian family. And Charlie is a good student in school. He has a host of friends. He's well liked by his teachers. And he gets pretty good grades. And then on the other side of the coin, there's Willie. Willie, as my dad and mother used to say, sort of comes from the other side of the tracks. And Willie's dad can't hold down a job because he has a problem with the bottle. He's an alcoholic. His mother may be home to get them supper on a Monday night, and she'll leave, and she might not be back until Wednesday. And when Charlie's mother and dad are at home, there's usually terrible arguments take place. And so Willie gets fair grades in school, but he doesn't have very many friends. And in today's society, he gets a lot of what we call bullying. And there you have the background of two young boys. And now for the rest of the story. One day in the spring, Charlie, for some reason, he is running late getting out of school. Most everybody has already left. And he comes out of the school and he looks off to the left and he sees a couple older boys kind of taunting Willie. And he knows Willie, but he just kind of shakes his head and continues down the sidewalk. And he gets down to the end of the sidewalk and he makes a right-hand turn to head to his house. And something brings him to a stop. And he hears a voice, and the voice says, "So you're going to let it go?" And he kind of looks around, there's nobody around. And he ends up and he said, "Well, what can I do?" "You can do a lot." And he says, "Well, I don't know what to say." "You'll say the right things." "Oh," he said, I can't do it. And so he takes a couple more steps. And the voice says, "Remember the story?" He said, about a man laying beaten and bloody and broken in a ditch. And he said, along came a priest. And he seen the man. And he crossed to the other side of the road to walk by him. He wouldn't walk by him there. And he said, along came a Levite. And he done the same thing. And finally he said, a man came by and bandaged up the man's wounds and took him and took care of him. And Charlie says, yes, the story of the Good Samaritan. And you can find the story in Luke 10th chapter, 25 through 37. And so he stands there a little bit, and he turns around, and he walks back, and he has no idea what he is going to say. So he gets about 20 feet away from Willie, and he's totally surprised by what comes out of his mouth. He just goes, "Willie, I thought you was going to walk home with me." And he is totally surprised. But what comes out of Willie's mouth surprises him even more. "Oh, I forgot. They hadn't had any conversation during the day." And the two other boys, they kind of taunt Charlie for getting Willie out of his predicament. And they walk down the street side by side, and they go a little ways, and there's nothing spoke. And finally Willie says, "Why did you turn around and come back?" Charlie says, "Well," he said, "you wouldn't understand." And he says, "I just know you wouldn't." He said, "Well, try me." He said, "I seen you come down the sidewalk." He said, "You stopped." Charlie goes, "Well, if you must know," he said, "Jesus told me to turn around and come back." And Willie says, "Yeah, right." He said, "You expect me to believe that?" Charlie said, "Well," he said, "that's the story." And he said, "I didn't want to, but I did." And so they walk down the walk a little ways further, and there's a little bit of conversation, and finally they get to the street where Willie has to turn down and go home. And he says, "Well, this is where I leave you." And Charlie kind of breathes a sigh of relief, because he really doesn't want to be seen walking with Willie. And Charlie just blurts out, "Well, you have a good night." But he could see the sadness in Willie's eyes. And he starts down the street, both of them. And the next thing Charlie hears Willie's voice. And it's like, oh, great. And so he turns, and Willie says, "I got a question for you." He said, "Can I walk to school with you tomorrow morning?" And Charlie said, "Well, yeah." But he said, "I'm usually here by 20 to 8. And he said, I can't wait." "Well, okay." And Charlie's like, "Now all my friends are going to see me with this boy." But he could also see that there was kind of a smile on Willie's face. And then he hears Willie again. And Willie says, "By the way," he said, "thanks for tonight." And Willie went down the street towards his home, and Charlie continued on his way. And he's thinking, now all my friends are going to see me. They're going to make fun of me. They're going to ask me questions why. And so he gets home, and Charlie's not himself at the supper table. And so his mother and dad say to him, "Well, what seems to be the problem?" And so he explains the situation to them. And, "Well, that's fantastic. You're a good Christian boy. You know what you have to do." "Yeah, but," he said, "my friends are going to make fun of me. They're going to laugh at me." And his dad said, "Well, you explain to them why." And he said, "They won't believe me." And Charlie's dad said, "Well, then maybe they're not your true friends." And so Charlie didn't sleep a lot that night. He ended up, every time he thought about, well, maybe I'll go early and tell them I forgot that I had something to get to school for. And, well, I could go late, tell them I overslept. But each time he knew that those stories wouldn't cut it. So that morning, he starts down the sidewalk, and sure enough, he was in hopes Willie wasn't going to be there. But there was Willie. And so they walked to school together, and sure enough, some of Charlie's friends seen him. And after Willie went his way, they asked him questions like, "What are you doing with that boy?" Well, and Charlie tried to explain, but they wouldn't listen. So, thus started a relationship, because the two boys kind of got to know each other. And Charlie done his best to try to mention Jesus, mention about the church and stuff, but each time Willie rebuffed him, saying, "My dad and mom don't believe in stuff like that, and it's just a way for people to get rich, and there's no such thing as a Jesus." And so this went on for a while, and finally Willie's mother, or Charlie's mother, said to him, she said, "Why don't you invite Willie over for supper? Mom, just do it." So the next day, Charlie asked Willie to come to their house for supper. And everything went really well. And at the end, they're sitting at the supper table. And of course, Charlie's parents had asked Willie different questions. And finally he said, "Well, I got to get home." He said, "My parents are going to be wondering where I'm at if they're home." And Charlie's mother said, "Well, just a minute." She said, "I have something for you." And she went and came into the dining room with a bag that had 3 or 4 sets of clothes in it, good clothes, because Charlie sometimes, or Willie sometimes, wore the same clothes to school 2-3 days in a row. And so he said, "Oh, ma'am," he said, "I can't take these." He said, "My dad don't believe in people giving stuff to others." And she said, "Just, you don't worry about it." She said, "You take them." She said, "It's just stuff that Charlie outgrew." And so Willie said, "Well, thanks." And so he leaves. And after he gets out, Charlie looks at his mother and he said, "Mom," he said, "that wasn't stuff I outgrew." He said, "I was with you the other day when you bought them clothes." And she said, "Yes, you was. But you have to remember, Charlie, there's a story in Matthew, the 25th chapter. And they tell about the sheep and the goats. And do you want to be a sheep or do you want to be a goat?" And if you read in the where'd my marker go? If you read in the 25th chapter of Matthew, starting with verse 35, "For I was hungered, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we hungry and fed thee, or thirsty and gave thee drink? When saw thee with a stranger and took thee in, or naked and clothed thee? Or when we saw ye sick and in prison, or came unto thee?" And the king shall answer and say unto him, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done this to one of the least of my brethren, you have done it unto me. And then shall he say unto them on the left hand, Depart from me, ye cursed, into everlasting fire, and prepared for the devil and his angels. And his mother said, "You really need to go and read that and think about it." And so Charlie did. And this relationship continued for a year, year and a half. And Charlie done his best to swing Willie around, but he wasn't making any progress.